Wonderful. How's everybody doing out there? Did we turn it? I think I might have turned it off. Nope. Does it work? It's good. Okay. Nice to see everybody. I'm just going to plug in while I have a second here. I just drove in from out of town. This is I don't know why, but everybody seems to organize like things in January. Oh, hello. How are you doing? You've got a future party coming up, don't you? Yes, of course. One thing nice about Wînipêk is you know everybody, right? And everybody knows you from like either this size or this size or this size or whatever they know you as. Anyway, it's nice to be here. Boshan den Magaduk Niigaan Webedam Indigenous class Namagoshin Dodem Imen Wendam Omayayan. Is there a certain spot I'm supposed to stand here? Boshan Shomasak, Takomasak, Mijana Gijik, Iban, Namiji Nibakwe. Hey, look back over there. And it's nice to see everybody. My name's Niigaan, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, but I really want to talk about what's happening here in this very special place. Should I just stand back here, I guess? Yeah, don't go anywhere, for God's sakes. Okay, don't drift. Don't come to your audience. Okay. What's happening in this very special place right here. And so I want to talk a little bit about, did you see Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech last night? Or yesterday? It wasn't last night, it was yesterday. Trump actually spoke last night. Wow, okay. So what did Prime Minister Mark Carney say yesterday? What he said is he went to the World Economic Forum, which is not a progressive place. It is a place predominantly of a lot of conservative, fiscal, free trade, a very competitive environment in which countries are encouraged to compete economically. And of course, while we see free trade emerging over the past few years, what we see is most markedly is the global economic markets, which are always in competition with each other. That leads to things like Brexit and things like that. My point of telling you that is what did Mark Carney say yesterday? He said, I'll call it a how to stand up to a bully speech, which was generally, we need to get together and give up on the United States. We have to sort of, if you face a bully, there's two ways that you can there's two ways that you can react. The first is you can turtle, you can sort of, think about those, I was a hockey player and I was a small guy, but I was a bit of a yappy guy, right? So if somebody comes after you, your choices are you better put them up or you can turtle. You can just go like this. And so if I had a big guy, I was like, okay, turtle time, here we go. And you just sort of protect yourself and hope someone's going to come in and help you. As Carney said yesterday, nobody's coming to help you. So you've got your other option, which is you got to find some friends. You got to stand collectively together and you got to double down on each other. So what has Carney done over the past month? He's signed agreements with China and Qatar, and that's the sound of your head exploding because we've been at competition. Everybody remember Hawaii, or what's it called? What was it called? Huawei or the Hawaii. Sorry, thank you. I was only on CBC for like a year talking about this, so I should tell you why I'm now on the Wednesday panel. I'm not on the Friday panel. The Friday panel is the weekly panel. The Wednesday panel is the bi-weekly panel. I get to pick my own topics for Wednesday. Friday, they just give you Doug Ford every week. Or in the case of Chinese alleged electoral interference, how everybody's worried about like EV cars or Pierre Poilievre saying, oh, we're going to have surveillance drones in our communities and we all choose to buy them, EV cars. I got this little news for you. Like 60% of Canadians have TikTok on their phone and they're listening. This isn't paranoid. Just say, I would like new blinds and see what ads come up on your phone. The phones are listening. And my point of it is that we're now sort of in relationship with this very complicated entity, which we have a very competitive relationship with. But even Carney has said, okay, we're going to double down on that. We're going to double down on Qatar. All these sort of very complicated relationships. And there's Carney in the World Economic Forum saying, let's all get together, double down on each other. Doesn't matter how we vote, how we think, how we act, human rights abuses even. We're going to double down on each other because that's how you stand up to a bully. Wow, it's a remarkable speech. Now here's my question to you. Who taught Mark Carney that the community is as important, if not more so, than the individuals. Now, here we are in the Treaty Relations building. This beautiful building. What a gorgeous space. What is treaty about? What's the point of treaty? Well, let's go back to the very first treaty in Manitoba, which is not Treaty 1. It's actually the Selkirk Treaty, right? The Selkirk Treaty in Manitoba from 1817, which is the first sort of recognized legal treaty. But of course, there's treaties before that between Indigenous peoples, between bears and fish, between the water and the shore, like there are the sun and the moon. There are treaties all across creation, but the treaty that really would be most legally recognized would be the Selkirk-Peguis Treaty of 1817, which was why, by the way, most of you have a mortgage. Because if you look on your mortgage, you will have plots from parishes. I do. It'll be like lot 52 from parish Saint whatever. That's from the Selkirk Treaty, because what Peguis did was he allocated certain non-Indigenous Canadian settlement, at the time British settlement, along the Red River, and of course parishes were established, and those parishes started to divide up river lots, right? 2 miles on each side of the river. That's where the first settlement in Manitoba comes from, but you don't often hear of like, how did that treaty come to be? Why is it that British people, who were for the most part, and forgiveness to all people who might be offended by this, very xenophobic people. Like, the British were very different to the Jaganashok, the French. So the French, very different. The French's position was, we're going to marry into Indigenous families. We don't have a problem with that. In fact, when the first Jesuits showed up and they saw the French, they were like, we can't tell the difference because the French are all speaking Ojibwe and Cree. They've all taken Ojibwe Cree names. Most of them have Ojibwe Cree children. The birth of the Métis Nation comes from the Bois Boulay, right? St. Boniface, that's where the big revolutionary Métis people come from, because it's from the French and the Anishinaabe and the Cree, who then birth out what really will be the autonomous Indigenous nation of Manitoba, the Red River Métis. The French, though, are quite innovative, so they get very far. They actually have a lot of inroads in Manitoba. The British, almost no inroads, until finally they show up in about 1797, and when they show up, they have the position that Indigenous peoples must work by our standards. They must trade only in our fort, they must only speak English or work in British pounds, or other money that we didn't delineate. And then, of course, we're never going to allow our traders to marry into Indigenous families, which, of course, for Indigenous peoples would be incredibly offensive, that you wouldn't allow family members to intermingle. And the evidence of that is in the very first season that the British show up. What would be the stupidest possible month to show up in Manitoba and expect to live? Everyone always says January. No, that's ludicrous. That's totally insane. You'd never make it past the sort of 5-6 feet snow drifts to get across the prairies to get here. The stupidest month to show up in Manitoba would be October, because you'd have hope. You would actually think to yourself, oh, I have enough time to get enough food and medicines and build a house of some kind or a lodge of some kind. And so the British showed up here in October, and they brought that attitude. Chief Peguis said, hey, come into our lodges, come into our homes. You look a little scurvied up, you should probably have a little bit of birch tea, you know what I mean? Like, come and sit by, have some soup, right? So come and visit with us, stay with us, we will take care of you. And the British, of course, were like, we're good. And they started building Fort Gibraltar just over here. Now, of course, I only have to show you what is this area. Look at the little brown stripes on those poles. What are those indicators of? Floodlines. And Chief Peguis was like, are you sure, Selkirk? That you want to build a fort over there? Maybe we should give you some advice. Probably not a great place to make a fort. Fort Gibraltar lasted 3 years, and then finally they just gave up on it, and then eventually made Upper Fort Garry over there, out of the floodplain. My point is that half the Selkirk settlers dead by Christmas. So Peguis went over to Selkirk, all the Selkirk settlers, picked them up, carried them to Fort Pembina, and said, hey, next time come in May. And that's the beginning of treaty. That's the beginning of the first treaty of Peguis and Selkirk, which is that the understanding was that the British could not simply dictate to others what it is that the relationships will operate in this place, because Indigenous peoples knew one fundamental truth. And this is an altruistic truth, this isn't a perfect truth, but it is the only truth of this territory, and it is that the only way we survive is if we share, look after each other, and the winter is coming. Thank you, Game of Thrones, for my little copyright, right? Because the only truth of this place is that when the winter is coming, you have to double down on the person beside you. It doesn't matter how they vote. It doesn't matter what they think. It doesn't matter how they act or even how they dress or what their sexuality is or how they vote. What matters is, will you share? That's what the truth of this place is. And Indigenous peoples knew this, not because we're perfect, because that's the only way you survive. When you turn on each other, meaning you turn to selfishness, individuality, competitiveness, what happens is we have a story for that. It's called When the Wendigo Arrives. The Wendigo is a cannibalistic being who's thought to be a spirit within our community in which we begin to consume each other. There's stories about cannibalism, there's stories about destruction and death, but the Wendigo stories are about what happens when people give up on community and turn towards individuality. That the community consumes itself. When the Hudson Bay settlers showed up, Hudson Bay Company settlers showed up, they were, for the most part, selfish, individualistic, competitive. We had to help them understand, or rather, the winter really had to help them understand, that you cannot live that way here. It's just not impossible. Like, for example, how long can you survive by yourself with no one helping you, no one looking after you, nobody standing there and offering you a hand outside today? Not very long. In fact, we have people right now in our community who are working together, sharing, even living down by the river in tents. But they need each other. They need to look after each other, which is why when we push people into those situations, we better offer them all the supports we possibly can do. Because that's how we as Wînipēgers are living. This is how we live as Manitowapow. This is how we live as Kanatians. That's the teaching of Kanata, which is not how do we compete or millions of dollars for one group of people, 1%, and 99% screw you. The word Kanata means the village, and the value of the village, as taught to Cartier by the Iroquoian people, is the value of the village is how do we support each other? How do we look after each other? How do we turn inwards and commit to this very complicated process of love? That's the hardest thing of all. My father said, reconciliation is never about when you agree. Reconciliation will never be found when you agree. Reconciliation will be found when you disagree and you commit to staying in the room. That's the key to reconciliation. And oh, by the way, that's treaty, almost exactly. Because treaty is never found in how much that we turn away from each other, we compete with one another. Treaty is found in how much do we share. And yes, we can have private space, but it is determinants in the public space, or if you see the Gashwentha, the Tura Wampum, it's in the white space, the space in between the blue paths, that reconciliation is found and relationship is found. And that's what my book's all about. Now, there's something special happening in here, this place. Let me give you a few barometers. So the first is that we are in this very interesting space called the Forks. The original name of this place, but not technically this place, just over there, is Nestawea, which means 3 points. When the first map makers came and started making books, they asked the Cree people who are in this area, who are the longest standing members of this area. The Dakota people, very close. The Dakota and Cree people are really the permanent inhabitants of the downtown core. The Anishinaabe, seasonal inhabitants. We would come up usually for the summertime, and we weren't until the late 19th century, after a great smallpox epidemic happened in 1783, that we then decided to stay. And we were invited by the Cree to go to Niigaan, also known as Selkirk or Netley Creek, which was where we settled, Chief Peguis settled. and eventually started creating an Anishinaabe permanent presence in Manitoba. That's created some very interesting relationships between Anishinaabe people in here. I could talk about that more later if you want. But when they asked the Cree people, they said, what's the name of this place? Well, they were writing down maps and everything. At the corner of Broadway and Main was a place called Nestawea, which was a permanent city of Indigenous peoples, mostly Dakota, Lakota, and Cree peoples, meaning 3 points. That's what the word Nestawea means. It's also the name for the river trail over here. 3 points means that people came from 3 directions. The north, the Cree, the Anishinaabe from the south, all on the Red River system, and from the Assiniboine system, the so-called Assiniboine people, or the Dakota Lakota people, Nakota people, who came from the west. This was a site of permanence, and that's why the Forks is such a misnomer. It's not a name that really Indigenous peoples would have come up with. It's not our name, because if you think of the Forks, it means 2 things come together and go this direction. It's like, this has always been the place of transience for Canada, because we were considered to be an economic hub for the East, or a resource colony, as what we might call it, for grain, for furs, for bone china, bison, early bone china is made out of bison. And then later, of course, now oil. You just have to see that the oil that goes through the railways. Of course, then potash and all these other different things that go in transport. The idea of Canada of this place has been the Forks, but that's not our idea. Our idea is permanence. People come here. In fact, there's a treaty space just over there, 1283, the Manitoba Museum, researched and found that there is evidence that in a great super drought in the late 12th century, there was a massive meeting here of thousands of Indigenous peoples who came to figure out how to share, how to commit, because people were turning on each other because everything was drying up. Goods were becoming scarce. Food was becoming scarce, and people were competing and warring all across this part of the world. And people as far south as Illinois, the city of Cahokia, the Indigenous city of Cahokia, people out west as far as the BC coast, and then in the east, out in what's known as the Wendat Confederacy. People came to this place, and the evidence is in the Manitoba Museum from the 1283 treaty that was signed here, what's now the Ball Stadium just over there. Now, I tell you that because this has always been the site of collaboration, of commitment. We are not the site of sending goods elsewhere or traveling elsewhere. We are the site of committing. That's what we are. And so all the names that we are about understanding what commitment means. Manitowapow is the word that describes our province, but it comes from the Narrows. It's the sound that of the waves crashing on the Narrows, another Cree word which refers to the kind of spirit of this place, which is about sound, beauty, and hue. Or Manitowapow, which is the other name for this place, refers to the teachings that have been placed down in the White Shell, which are all, if you travel to the White Shell, teachings about treaty. They're teachings about coming together, working with animals, working with a people, and making ceremony in that space. In fact, the great big teaching called the Path of Life in Manitowapow is about 2 paths coming together to create one path. Like, how do we come together to create all of these things, which we now know, part of that, the Red River Métis, but also today, what we're doing right here. Just coming together, trying to figure out ways that we can live, work, and act together. So you ask me, and this is what I ask students sometimes. I always ask students, I say, where does democracy come from? And usually some student puts up their hand and says, Plato. Now my question to you is, when Canadians, Indigenous peoples, French, were coming together to build a country, treaty, to face the winter together, did they turn to competitiveness, individuality, capitalism, which were things that were brought here? Or did they turn to collaboration, commitment, looking after each other and building the lodge together? And then, do you really think that they were like, we got to come up with a government. Oh, there happens to be a copy of Plato right here. Let's just follow that. By the way, if you read Plato, That's not democracy. That's the 1%. It's the thought leaders who lead all of us, and we're all ditch diggers. That's what Plato's democracy looks like. It's not even democracy. What is more likely? That the people who invented the idea that when you make a circle to come to a decision, everybody gets to have a say, and the grandmothers who look out, who listen even when people disagree, go, this is the decision. We go, hey, Carney, okay? That's called the Supreme Court, which is how our communities operated. We had collaboration, we had commitment, we had conversation, but it was the grandmothers who made the decision, this is our unanimous compromise. That's where Canada comes from. Now I ask you once again, if you have the Canadian Prime Minister who's going to the world stage and saying that we have to commit to each other and not be competitive, capitalistic, and build walls between each other, where did he learn that from? Here's a hint, not the Hudson Bay Company. I think that the more that we understand that what makes us amazing isn't just British and French contributions. And of course, we know that British and French people have done amazing things. They helped us imagine, like Sir John A. Macdonald, the person who we can, slag the most. Like literally the evidence of Sir John A. Macdonald's right there, the train line. But Sir John A. Macdonald also brought us together, French and English people, to come together to the Great Compromise of Upper and Lower Canada. And as a result, the British people came, the French people came together, and they had already come together during the War of 1812 and faced off against the Americans, but would have been defeated in a weekend, if not for the fact that 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 Indigenous soldiers, warriors from Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's alliance made sure that we fortified that border, protected, and also made sure that we're not flying all American flags. Because the British would have been defeated in a weekend, maybe a month. But Sir Isaac Brock was able to bring Tecumseh and convince him through the promise of an Indigenous state that that would happen. And of course, the British didn't fulfill that promise, really lied about that. Or maybe Sir Isaac Brock didn't feel the diffusion or support amongst other British soldiers to get there. My point is that we in Manitoba are doing something interesting. There are, right now, 3,200, and I can never remember it's 48 or 84 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis students at the University of Manitoba today. That's the largest on-campus community ever in history of any group of Indigenous students, anytime, anywhere. University of Saskatchewan, yeah, I applaud, that's great. Yeah. University of Saskatchewan, 3,100. So they're coming up, right? Way to go, Saskatchewan, keep them up. You could have the Grey Cup, but we get the highest amount of Indigenous students. My point is like something interesting is happening here. So I happen to be one of those students who came through our university system here. When I was growing up, I can tell you how many Indigenous teachers I had. 0. None. I had no Indigenous teachers at any point in any time in my history. I did, however, have Indigenous educational assistants. I had Indigenous administrative assistants. I had Indigenous counselors, but I never had an Indigenous teacher. Some of the most profound people I ever had was Mr. Lepere, Miss Busby, Miss Duchek, Mrs. Peters, Mr. Peters. There are a lot of married people in Selkirk, by the way. Right? But the most profound one that I've ever had was Mrs. Richter in grade 6 in Ashern, Manitoba. Now, Mrs. Richter was this amazing lady. She's passed on now. Mrs. Richter was this amazing grade 6 teacher that I had in Ashern Central School in grade 6. When I was in the Ashern Central School in the Interlake, everybody know where Ashern is? You're from there? Oh, you know. Ashern is services for First Nations who are then bussed in, and one of them is Fisher River Cree Nation, right? And so Mrs. Richter was faced with a grade 6 classroom that was 30 students. And what we had is we had 15 or so First Nation students who all played together at recess because they knew each other, or they generally met each other, usually on the buses in the morning and coming in. Then what you had is 15 or so town kids or farming kids. These were mostly German, Scottish, French, These are names like Reckdale, Sveistrup, Freeman. These are all these kinds of people that I knew. I was a town kid, but I was the only First Nations town kid, and that was because my parents had just divorced. My mom moved to Ashern because that was the only job she could get, but she was a community mental health worker. She worked mostly with Indigenous peoples on reserve to support people in mental health crisis and so on and so forth. But I was a town kid, so I tended to play with the farming kids. But I had a few friends amongst First Nations kids because I played hockey with them, right? People like Monkmans, Stevensons, so on. And my point of it is that Mrs. Richter saw these very divided. I was kind of the anomaly. I was the only kid that really played with both groups, but I really noticed how they never played together. Like when I tried to play with this group, I ended up not playing with any of my town friends. When I played with my town friends, I never played with any of the kids over here. So Mrs. Richter looked out and she saw these very divided communities. And she said, what am I going to do about that as a grade 6 teacher? And she was in charge of the Christmas pageant, which is a really big thing in Ashern, Manitoba. Like the whole town comes out for the grade 4, 5, and 6 Christmas pageant. And the grade 6s get to do the actual birth story of Jesus. So Mrs. Richter looked at the audience and went, okay, or looked at her students and said, okay, Tricia, the daughter of the RCMP officer in town, you're going to be Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then she picked Carmen from Fisher River Cree Nation to be Joseph. And that, my friends, is the interracial baby Jesus. Mrs. Richter said, I'm just going to put it out there on the Christmas pageant night and say, hey, everybody, deal with this. In her own 1986 Ashern Christmas pageant public school way. She was like, deal with it. And that's pretty radical if you think about it. It's pretty crazy. 1986 in Manitoba, in a little gym just north of here, the entire community would have to look up and go, what does this mean for us to have an interracial, Indigenous, half Canadian baby Jesus? Now, my mother tells this story, and this is one of my favorite stories. Now, I was a shepherd. I had a bathrobe and a towel, terribly racist, and that means that what I did is I got to sing We Three Kings, Silent Night, and my mom said that I was a big caroler. I liked singing a lot, so she said that she was very excited for me because on the night of all the shepherds, and there was like 100 of us, we all sit on stage and then we watch the kind of birth story of the birth of Jesus and the manger and the three kings show up and all this kind of jazzy stuff. Anyways, so on the night of the pageant, the gym is packed. And Mrs. Richter comes to me and she says, all of the First Nations can't show up because the roads are too snowed in. So Carmen's not making it. Now, Mrs. Richter had a choice. She could have picked any kid out of all the town and farm kids, but she said, hey, Niigaan, you're going to be Joseph. And I said, Mrs. Richter, I haven't rehearsed. And she said, don't worry, you just have to do this. That's all you have to do. Literally, just look for the nod and then do this. And then I said, okay, I can do that. So on that night, my mother said, and she in our podcast for the Free Press, she actually recorded a version of this. You can actually hear her telling this live if you ever want to hear it. She said, I was looking in the audience, I was sitting in the audience, and I was looking on stage, looking for my little baby boy, the shepherd. And I look and I scan, and then I look up, and I realize that I am the grandmother of reconciliation. Aww. Because my mother, being a French-Canadian woman, literally went, my son is the father of Jesus. What does that mean for me? And that, my friends, is Manitoba. I'm not telling you that the grade 6 pageant in 1986 changed anything, but it, man, was provocative. And we do that all the time here. We now have invested in 3,200 and I'll say 84 First Nations, Inuit, Métis students who all have very complex, interesting experiences going through the public education system. Some good, some bad, some great, some ugly, but they made it. They're there, and they're there predominantly because of non-Indigenous teachers who have committed and supported them and made sure that they're prepared and ready. There's also a lot of Indigenous teachers now too. We have more Indigenous teachers than we've ever had in history. We have more public art than that's Indigenous created than any time in history. We have, just over here, all Indigenous signage in Indigenous languages. That's funded by the Wînipêk Foundation, which is funded predominantly by non-Indigenous Winnipeggers, Canadian Winnipeggers, newcomers. There's something interesting happening here. I could keep going. We're about to have the very first monument at the Manitoba Legislature for a First Nations contributor, Chief Peguis. Until 2026, we never had one recognition of First Nations contributions to Manitoba at our center of power. And students in 2021, as I wrote in my book, said, enough. That's not acceptable. We're going to install our own art pieces at the Manitoba Legislature by editing Queen Victoria and editing Queen Elizabeth. Nobody got hurt. In fact, people got seen for the very first time. And it was uncomfortable, don't get me wrong. My dad actually said, this is vandalism. And I phoned up my dad and I said, hey Dad, you think you might have had something to do with this? He goes, no, I would never tell people to vandalize anything. I said, every single one of those people were Indigenous and Canadian young people who pulled down that statue and edited it with orange flags and red handprints. Red handprints recognizing murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls. Orange flags recognizing the 215 potential unmarked graves at Kamloops. Both of whom, by the way, facilitated by Queen Victoria, the most aggressive monarch in history, who, yes, was the monarch, maybe benevolent, but absolutely oversaw the most amount of land theft in history. Also oversaw the Indian Act, the residential school system, and oversaw what has been some of the most brutal policies against Indigenous peoples in history. She can maybe use a little editing. And young people who knew exactly what they are doing made a statement, made a piece of public art, and it didn't cost the taxpayers a dime. And they installed the first First Nations artistic contribution at the Manitoba Legislature. And so I said to Dad, do you think you might have had something to do with this? Teaching at every classroom, boardroom, courtroom, all across this province? Teaching young people to be proud of themselves, to understand history, and that when they see injustice, their job is to stand up and do something about it. Don't harm others, but have your voice be seen. And Dad said, I'll take my tweet down. Because I said, reconciliation ain't supposed to be comfortable, everybody. This ain't supposed to be like some sort of easy journey, because change is going to be tough. If we are used to not seeing each other, and then we see each other for the very first time, it's startling. But it means that we have to commit to something, which is where territorial acknowledgements come so important, because it's not about just saying we recognize that we share territory. It's now, what do we do about it? That's why territorial acknowledgements always have to have that commitment phrase. We commit to doing this thing. A few other things that are happening this week. There's a round dance honoring my father on Friday. His birthday is Saturday. You're all invited, by the way. You do not have to be Indigenous to come to the round dance. In fact, that's the whole point. The whole point of the round dance is everybody's invited. If Dad helped you, taught you something, if you want to honor him in some way, even if you're not able to come, I encourage you to put a little bit of food out for him because he's going to be around. His favorite foods, carrot cake, oatmeal, mushrooms. Mushroom pizza is favorite. If you put a little piece of mushroom pizza out for him, he'll come and visit you. This week also, though, is the Sakawea, the music festival, the Indigenous Music Festival is this weekend. You're going to have a chance to see Indigenous music all across the city. You're going to have a chance to see the Winnipeg Jets with 15,000 fans honor Inuit, First Nations, and Métis contributions in our community. They're going to bring them to center ice. 15,000 people are going to cheer for it. We remain the only NHL city that when the territorial acknowledgement is made, people applaud. Something special is happening in this place. We're not perfect. God, we are not perfect. We still have the most amount of children in the child welfare system, Indigenous children. We still have the most amount of Indigenous young people in the prison system. We still have the most amount of egregious acts against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples. And the evidence of that is just look at the last provincial election. which was fought over the question, not about healthcare, not about parental rights. It was about, do Indigenous women matter? The majority of Manitobans, though, said they do. For the first time in history, imagine that election taking place in 1986. And then imagine whether Mrs. Richter had a role in helping us see that maybe Indigenous peoples matter too. And that we're doing something about it. We got a First Nations guy running the place over there. No monument. We got a First Nations guy running. We also, in the cabinet, more First Nations women, Two-Spirit people, queer people, than have ever been in a Manitoba cabinet and government in history. We also have First Nations, Métis people in the other parties, more than ever in history. We also elected one of two First Nations women in the federal cabinet with Rebecca Chartrand. My point is like something interesting's happening here, right? We're not perfect. We certainly got a lot of work to do, but like something interesting is happening. Now, in 2000 and, I don't remember, I think it was 18, 17, Maclean's magazine sent a reporter for a coffee break to Wînipêk. They got tired of covering Tug Ford every 5 seconds over there, and they decided to come and cover Wînipêk. And they sent a former Winnipegger who came in as a reporter and interviewed a few people. Spent generally a couple days here, and then pronounced that we are the most racist city in the galaxy, which I said is probably the stupidest thing I've ever heard of in my life, because have you been to BC? Have you been to Vancouver? Have you been to Saskatoon? Have you been to Toronto, where they don't even talk about the darn issue? Like, Saskatoon was overjoyed that we are the most racist city in the galaxy. But if you've been to Saskatoon, it's the home of the famous Starlight tours, right? Where the police would leave First Nations people in minus 40-degree climate and force them to walk back in, usually when they're at their most vulnerable. And people died. If you go to Regina, there's literally a train track that separates the city. Indigenous peoples live on one side, Canadians live on the other, and you can see where the poverty begins. Thunder Bay. I got to say more about Thunder Bay. How about Vancouver? Robert Picton. All I have to say to say that Vancouver's got a racism problem. But yet, this is exactly the problem. The exact problem is that we are seen as the country, or the country perhaps needs a scapegoat for its long-standing policies of racism. And they can point to Wînipêk and go, well, there's evidence of racism. We are not the most racist city in this country. We are the inheritors of some of the most racist policies which began here. We're the first treaty, we're the first province, we're the first residential schools that come in the modern era. And therefore, yeah, man, I don't have to prove to you that there's systemic racism here. I don't have to prove to you that there's racism happening in policing, healthcare, child welfare. Like, I don't have to prove that to you. Just go spend 5 minutes in any of those systems. Go right now to the Health Science Center and ask yourself who's in the ER. The vast majority Indigenous peoples. Most of the issues that come from that, poverty. Poverty comes from lack of employability or situations of trauma. Where did that come from? Residential schools, land theft, constant marginalization being followed in the 7-Eleven. Like, you can actually draw a direct line from all of that. We have inherited all of that, but my argument in my book is we didn't invent it. In fact, what did we invent? How to survive the winter. That's what we invented here. So I'm not telling you that we don't practice racism. I'm telling you that there might be solutions here to racism that are not just applicable here, but are actually applicable now on the world stage, as proved by Mark Carney at the World Economic Forum. That we as Indigenous peoples, joining with our brothers and sisters, and the fact is that if you're a Manitoban, you work beside, live beside, or are married to an Indigenous person. But we don't always see each other. When I was a young man, I used to follow my dad around. He'd bring me to all of his events, sometimes. I was actually really mad at my dad for a really long time because he didn't come to a lot of my things. He was too busy being a dad to you and not a dad to me. So I was mad at him for a long time. I was mad at you all for a long time. So if any of you knew me, we're going to say 30 years ago, I was one angry guy. I was very, very angry. I was very self-harming too, using a lot of alcohol, doing a lot of things to myself. And part of that was because I was so angry at my dad. I was so angry. And it was only when I became a father, when I realized something, that he wasn't just doing that for you, he was also doing that for me and his granddaughter. Because when he was talking to you, he was saying, let's bring more Indigenous peoples into this conversation. Here's what I know. Here's how we can commit to each other. Here's how we can learn from one another. And then he would often, my dad's favorite time, was usually sitting in the back, not in the front, but sitting in the back, eating usually date squares. What's the thing with the chocolate on top? Nanaimo bar. That's his favorite, God. Or puff wheat cake.
Yes.
That's my dad's favorite. He would sit in the back and he would visit. And I'd get really annoyed with my dad because he'd be there for hours visiting. He just loved visiting because he really believed that if we just visit enough, if we just learn enough, if we just laugh enough, but if we argue and stay committed to each other enough, we can do anything. And that's really what Manitoba's been all about. Is I got to watch my dad do that. And my dad was the first of a generation of every room that he walked into. And so when I would walk around with my dad, he was the first Indigenous person often in classrooms, courtrooms, boardrooms. But he wasn't the first Indigenous person. But he was the first Indigenous person. Here's what I mean. Is, you know how many people have gone up to Dad in my life, and I've been standing there in the Garden City Shopping Center food court, and people come up to him and they say, you know, Murray, you are the first Indigenous person I've ever met. You're in Manitoba. Like 1/5 of us are Indigenous. And like I didn't interrupt the guy because he was quite well-meaning, but I'm like, are you stupid? Like, this is Manitoba. Do you know what I realized? And is that my dad wasn't the first Indigenous person people met, but it was the first Indigenous person they saw. Because he was the first Indigenous professional. He was the first Indigenous person in power, because he was a judge or a lawyer. They had to listen to him. Or he was the first Indigenous person that would be standing at the front of a room and was invited to speak by someone else. And my dad was empowered by a lot of non-Indigenous peoples. Howard Pawley, former premier, being the number one, who was my dad's first boss. If not for Howard Pawley, Dad would have continued to be the worst bingo caller in Selkirk history at the Friendship Center. By the way, he was the worst bingo caller ever. All the grannies hated him. He took way too long to call, and he would make these terrible jokes in between all the numbers, and all the grannies are like, shut up and just call the number. My dad would probably be still, he'd be known as the worst bingo caller of all time, but Howard Pawley saw something in him, said, why don't you be a law student, and then gave him time and support in order to do that. Of course, then there's all the women that my dad stood up for my dad. Those are like my mother, my biological mother. Then, of course, my dad's second wife, Catherine, who is my other mother. If you know her, she supported him through his whole career. Then, of course, my sisters, who are really the smartest Sinclairs of all. You get a chance to meet my sister Danae, or Gajik, or Gige, or Misko. I have 4 amazing sisters. That's called an exercise in humility, because I'm the only boy. But really, the woman that is really to matter for my father was Granny Kate. The person who raised my dad was his grandmother, my great-grandmother, Catherine Simard from Manicatogan. And that's who really raised my dad. And she raised him to be a very strong Anishinaabe person. But the center core of who he was from her biggest message when he wanted to go to university instead of becoming a priest, because she wanted him to become a priest. In fact, when he said, I want to go to university, she said, what do you want to do? He said, a phys ed teacher, and she cried for 3 days. No complaints to phys ed teachers, but wasn't a priest. She made him promise to always work for the people and love the people, even when they don't love you. And that's been the big message, I think, of what my dad's whole job of reconciliation was to do, was to try to bring the idea that if we just commit to each other, if we just listen, if we just learn, we can do anything. Now, my dad was the first Indigenous person to be seen maybe in many courtrooms, boardrooms, classrooms. When I went to my dad, I turned to him when I was 18. I said, hey, Dad, I hear you can make $1 million being a lawyer. I should enter law. He said, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard in my life, because entering the law is not what we need as a people. What I would like you to become is a teacher. because we need teachers more than anything. We need teachers to help raise Canadian and Indigenous young people to be proud of themselves, to see themselves as worthy, and then help Canadians see us. Help everybody to see that they are amazing, beautiful, possible people. So then Dad invested in me, and I always thought I was like special. And then now that I've been older, I've realized that he said that to every single Indigenous young person he ever met. He said, be a teacher or be a person who is kind and giving, help others to see that we are remarkable people. The best thing you can ever do is be proud of who you are. Be proud of your language, be proud of your culture, and then help others to understand that what we have done is invested in Canadians amazing, beautiful, remarkable gifts, which is how to survive the winter, how to build treaty, and how to live in this place forever. How to read Manitowapi, how to hear the sounds of Manitowapow, and how to commit to each other, to make art, to build students, to make even a First Nations premier. Which I'm not telling you is the most remarkable thing of all time. I'm not even telling you that Wab Kinew is a great premier. But I am telling you that he found those women leading the search in 4 weeks. 1/10 the budget. So don't tell me they weren't feasible to search for. What a bunch of bullshit. The Wînipêk police chief said that. The former premier said they weren't worth searching for. Turns out they were. And it was easy. Not easy, but it was worth it. It was a hard process for us to get through, to learn that when we commit to each other, we become the fullest Manitobans of all. We can face that winter. Colonialism will be easy because we've overcome the biggest struggles of all, which is seeing each other. Now, my dad raised this critical generation, which is you. This is you. He went to your courtrooms, boardrooms, classrooms. He spent time visiting with you, encouraging you, and now look at you. Here you are. You took time out of your noon hour. This isn't probably the only event you've gone to in your life. You've gone to many other events, heard many other people, amazing Indigenous peoples all throughout our community, amazing Canadian people who are stepping up with us. A few of you are here today, who I know are doing ally work, walking with Mama Bear Clan, working with communities, working with Indigenous organizations to try to bring forth really remarkable change. Being in this space, helping Manitobans see this space as beautiful and remarkable. This doesn't just come from the Treaty Relations Commission, this comes from the really visionary work of the Forks. People who are Canadians who see this as valuable and want to support and commit and make this place important. And that means that something special is happening here. Something special that the rest of the country is probably going to need. The only way we're going to get any projects of national importance or significance or whatever the term is that they use, national interest, sorry. The only way we're going to get any of those projects done is by working together. It's never going to be on dictating, arresting, blockading, fighting. Those things are never going to get any projects done. In fact, what they will do is create acrimony, division, competitiveness, individuality, capitalism. Those things are important, some of them, but what is far more important is how do we commit to each other, and that's really what my book's all about. My book is all about how do we learn about treaty, take all the things that we've learned from going back to the early times of the early settlers, Indigenous peoples, learning about our mistakes, but then most importantly, committing to each other to build a remarkable, beautiful place together. So I hope that that's what we do, not just today, but every day. There is a Ledger poll that came out last year, which said that 35% of Canadians have an orange shirt and go to an event on September 30th. So 35%. So let's do the math. 40 million Canadians, 35% of that, 14 million Canadians. That holiday, if it is one, it's here or there. Here's a holiday. Now in Ontario, it's not. That day of honoring, of commemoration, of commitment, which when people wear an orange shirt and they go to something, for about 15 minutes, they're doing something. I'm not telling you that that's changing anything, bringing forth reconciliation. I'm not even telling you that 15 minutes means anything, but I'm telling you that that thing is 5 years old. Tell me something in this country, you can't even tell me a TV show is that anymore, that people do together for 15 minutes on one day. And it's only taken 5 years to bring 14 million people to do it. What's it going to look like next year? 15, 16? I've actually stopped when I travel around the country and I go all across coast to coast to coast, heading to Iqaluit next week, which is like insane, right? Or no, 2 weeks from now. I'm a little nervous about it, but anyways, it's cold up there, that's right. Is I say, I actually stopped saying to people, who has an orange shirt? I used to get people to put their hands up because I realized that people who don't have orange shirts actually are starting to feel ashamed. Because the majority is committing to the spirit of reconciliation, and it is in Manitoba more than ever. In fact, we have a holiday in which we do something on our day off. It's not like other places where they do it in workplaces. We commit to doing it on our spare time. We're going to do it at the Jets game. We're going to do it Friday night at the Round Dance. We're going to do it right now. The question is never about just seeing each other, though. It's about what are we going to do now about it. So what I hope is from this session that you continue to support this beautiful space and building and all Jeremy and Commissioner Ross and all the great people here at the TRCM, but also talk to someone outside of this room who perhaps would never come in this space. Tell them about what you learned. Tell them about what you think. And don't always say things because I said them. Do your own research. Like, do your own Googling. Do your own watching Power and Politics at 5:30 on Wednesdays. That's a joke, by the way. APTN, by the way, Thursdays, 4:30. But do your own learning, do your own conversations. I promise you that reconciliation will start in that Tim Hortons with your conversation. Because they will never listen to me. They won't listen to Dad, but they will listen to you. And that's where reconciliation will be. It's, when Dad, in one of his final acts during the TRC, he said, "We have shown you the mountain, now we call upon you to do the climbing." He did not say, "We now call Niigaan to do all the climbing for you." He did not say Justin Trudeau or Wab Kinew will do the climbing for you. He said, you have to do the climbing. All of us. Indigenous peoples have been climbing more than anyone else. So join with them. Step up. And try to make this community, I think, what we already are, which are incredible visionaries of how to live and work and be together. Might even call that reconciliation. But also how to change the world. And we saw it yesterday. We saw a Prime Minister who had learned things from this country, which are at its core Indigenous, and bring those things to the world. Kanata. Miigwech, everybody. Thank you very much for that.